The same rifle. The same man. One battlefield made him untouchable. Another made him invisible. In 4 days on Guadalcanal, 2nd Lieutenant John George killed 11 Japanese snipers with 11 careful shots. In 78 days in Burma, he fired 3 times. Same weapon, same skill, different war. This is the story of how the jungle didn't just swallow an army. It swallowed an entire way of fighting, and proved that the future of war belonged not to the patient marksman, but to the man who could fire fast and keep moving. What happened in those 78 days would quietly rewrite American doctrine, retire a generation of thinking, and leave one beautifully crafted rifle gathering dust in a museum as a monument to obsolescence. The Winchester Model 70 that John George carried into Burma in March 1944 was not a standard-issue weapon. It was a handcrafted precision instrument, built around the controlled feed Mauser action that Winchester had refined into something approaching mechanical poetry. The bolt moved like silk over glass. The trigger broke cleanly at 3 pounds. The barrel was free-floated, bedded into an experimental lightweight synthetic stock that shaved precious ounces without sacrificing rigidity. In an age when most military rifles were stamped steel and mass-produced walnut, this was a bespoke tool, the kind of thing a craftsman would build if weight, money, and time were no object and the only metric that mattered was putting a bullet exactly where you looked. George had zeroed it at 200 yards, then verified the holds at 3, 4, and 500. He knew the rifle. He trusted it the way a surgeon trusts his hands. He had earned that trust on Guadalcanal. August 1942. The island was a fetid strip of jungle and coral where men died as much from malaria and dysentery as from bullets, but it was the first major ground offensive against Japan, and it mattered. The Japanese had taken the Pacific with terrifying speed, and Guadalcanal was where America planted its feet and said no further. George arrived as a newly minted Marine lieutenant with a shooter's resume and a quiet, methodical temperament. He didn't talk much. He watched, and when the opportunity came, he took it with surgical precision. The Japanese had their own sniper doctrine, refined in China and Manchuria. Their marksmen used the Arisaka Type 97, a solid if unspectacular bolt-action rifle, and they employed it with patience and lethality. They would tie themselves into trees, camouflage into the canopy, and wait. American patrols would pass underneath, and then a single crack would drop the lead man or the officer or the radio man, and the shot would come from nowhere. It was psychological warfare as much as marksmanship. The Americans learned to hate the jungle, to scan every tree, to freeze at the sound of rustling leaves. The Japanese snipers owned the vertical battlefield. George went into that same jungle and turned it against them. He studied their hides, their movement patterns, the way sunlight glinted off a rifle scope or the way a particular branch bent under human weight. He learned to see what didn't belong. And then he began to hunt. In 4 days, he killed 11 of them. Not spraying fire, not suppressing, not lucky shots in a firefight. 11 deliberate engagements. 11 trigger presses. 11 men who stopped being a problem. The Japanese snipers had terrified the Marines, and George made them mortal again. His battalion commander mentioned it in a report. His fellow officers bought him a beer. Word spread quietly through the division that there was a guy with a fancy rifle who could actually do the job. George's war on Guadalcanal lasted longer than those 4 days, but those 4 days defined him. He became the proof of concept. The sniper doctrine worked. Precision mattered. One good marksman with one good rifle could shift the tactical balance. When Merrill's Marauders began forming in late 1943, George's name surfaced. The unit, officially designated the 5,307th Composite Unit, provisional, codenamed Galahad, was an experimental deep penetration force designed to operate behind Japanese lines in northern Burma. The strategic goal was simple in theory and nightmarish in execution. March through some of the most hostile terrain on Earth, cut Japanese supply lines, and support British General Joseph Stilwell's larger offensive to reopen the Burma Road and restore a land route to China. The Japanese had conquered Burma in 1942, and the Allies needed it back. The Marauders would be the tip of that spear. 3,000 men, hand-picked volunteers, trained for jungle warfare and long-range patrolling. No heavy vehicles. No extraction plan if things went bad. Just legs, rifles, and the assumption that being behind enemy lines would somehow be an advantage. George joined as an intelligence officer and the unit's designated marksman. He brought the Winchester. The rifle had served him well in the Solomons, and there was no reason to think Burma would be different. Jungle was jungle. Patience was patience. The principles of marksmanship didn't change with longitude. He cleaned the rifle, checked the scope, packed his kit, and deployed with the confidence of a man who had done this before. Burma disabused him of that confidence within a week. The terrain alone was an enemy. Guadalcanal had been oppressive, malarial, a place where the jungle tried to kill you passively through heat and disease and exhaustion. Burma was that, but worse, and it fought back. The Marauders landed at Lido in northern Assam and began their march south through the Hukawng Valley in early March 1944. The valley was a drowned green hell. Monsoon season hadn't started yet, but the land was perpetually wet. The kind of wet that soaked through ponchos and rotted boot leather and turned every depression into a sucking mud trap. Trails didn't exist in any meaningful sense. What the maps called trails were suggestions. Faint corridors through bamboo thickets and teak forest where the jungle pressed in from all sides and every step forward had to be negotiated with a machete. Visibility was measured in yards, sometimes feet. You couldn't see the sky. You couldn't see more than one bend ahead on the trail. The jungle canopy filtered the sunlight into a dim green twilight that never quite became darkness and never quite became day. And then there were the leeches. They dropped from branches, crawled up from the ground, wormed into boots and collars and the gaps in gaiters. Men would stop to rest and pull a dozen off their legs. The leeches didn't hurt, not at first, but they left wounds that didn't heal, that festered in the humidity and became infected, and infection in Burma meant fever, and fever meant you fell behind, and falling behind meant you didn't make it. Malaria was endemic. Dysentery tore through the unit. Men lost 20, 30 pounds in a month. They shit themselves on the march because stopping meant losing the column. The Marauders had been handpicked for fitness, and Burma stripped them down to skeletons anyway. George marched with the 2nd Battalion, carrying the Winchester, a sidearm, ammunition, water, rations, and the basic infantry load. The rifle weighed just over 8 pounds unloaded, light for a precision weapon but still dead weight on a march measured in hundreds of miles. The synthetic stock helped, but weight is weight, and after the first week, everything felt heavy. His scope was a unertl 8 power, a beautiful piece of glass, clear and bright and utterly useless in jungle where you couldn't see 800 yards if your life depended on it. He kept it covered, wrapped in cloth to protect it from moisture and impact, and he began to understand that the weapon he'd brought to Burma was designed for a different kind of war. The Marauders moved fast because they had no choice. Their mission depended on speed and surprise. Stay ahead of the Japanese, hit supply lines, vanish before a response could be organized. That meant forced marches, 15 miles a day through terrain where 5 miles was an accomplishment. It meant no fortified positions, no time to dig in, no opportunity to establish overwatch or set up hides or do any of the things that made sniping effective. George's training, all that careful fieldcraft and patient stalking, assumed a static battlefield where the sniper could find a position and wait. Burma was the opposite. The battle moved, constantly, and if you didn't move with it, you were left behind or overrun. The first real engagement came in late March, near the village of Wallabam. The Marauders had circled behind a Japanese regiment and set up a blocking position on the trail leading south. The plan was to ambush a supply column and disrupt their logistics. George found a spot on a low ridge overlooking the trail, maybe 400 yards of clear sightline before the jungle closed in again. It was the first time since landing in Burma that he'd had anything resembling a sniper's position. He settled in, rifle braced against a fallen log, scope uncovered, watching the trail through the early morning mist. The Japanese came just after dawn. Not a supply column, an infantry company, moving in loose patrol formation, rifles slung, relaxed. They didn't expect contact this far north. George ranged the lead elements. For 110 yards. The officer was in the middle of the column, distinguishable by his sword and his posture, the way the men around him deferred. George put the crosshairs on his chest, let out half a breath, and pressed the trigger. The Winchester's report was sharp and flat, a distinctive crack that echoed off the ridge and rolled through the valley. The officer went down. The column froze for a heartbeat, and then the Marauders opened up with everything. Automatic weapons, M1 Garands, a few bars. The ambush was devastatingly effective. The Japanese were caught in the open with no cover, and the Marauders poured fire into them for 90 seconds before breaking contact and melting back into the jungle. George chambered another round, scanned for another target, but the jungle had already swallowed both sides. The engagement was over. He'd fired once. That shot, that 400-yard kill, was perfect. Textbook. The kind of thing they'd write up in a manual. But it was also the only time in the entire Wollobam engagement where George's rifle mattered. The fight wasn't won by precision. It was won by volume. The Marauders had poured hundreds of rounds downrange in less than 2 minutes, and that overwhelming firepower, that shock and saturation, had shattered the Japanese formation. George's single shot had killed 1 man. The Garands and bars had killed dozens. And more importantly, the ambush had succeeded not because of accuracy but because of aggression. Hit hard, hit fast, and disappear. That was the doctrine that worked in Burma. The second shot came 3 weeks later, near Shaduzup. The Marauders were pushing south toward Myitkyina, and the Japanese were finally organizing a coherent defense. Skirmishes became daily. George's battalion was moving down a ridgeline when they started taking fire from a machine gun position on the opposite slope. The gun was dug in, good field of fire, and it was pinning down the lead platoon. George could see the muzzle flash through the trees, maybe 300 yards across the draw. He found a stable rest, put the scope on the gun position, waited for movement. The gunner shifted, just a silhouette behind the weapon, and George fired. The machine gun went silent. Whether he'd killed the gunner or just forced him off the weapon didn't matter tactically. The effect was the same. The platoon advanced, the position was overrun, and the column kept moving. 2 shots, 2 hits, 2 tactically relevant outcomes. George was doing his job and doing it well, but he was also starting to understand the math. The Marauders were in continuous contact with the enemy, firefights and skirmishes and ambushes every few days, and in those engagements, George's rifle spoke twice while the men around him fired hundreds of times. The M1 Garand, the standard American infantry rifle, held 8 rounds in an en-bloc clip and could be reloaded in seconds. A decent rifleman could put accurate fire downrange at a rate that made the bolt-action Winchester look glacial by comparison. And in jungle fighting, where engagements happened at 50 yards and ended in 30 seconds, rate of fire mattered more than precision. The man with 8 fast shots beat the man with 1 perfect shot, because war at close range isn't a marksmanship competition. It's violence, and violence rewards speed. George also began to notice something else. The Winchester's report was distinctive. It didn't sound like a Garand. It didn't sound like a Japanese Arisaka. It sounded like what it was, a high-powered hunting rifle with a different powder load and a different barrel length, and that distinctiveness was a problem. When George fired, everyone within earshot knew someone had fired a non-standard weapon. In theory, that shouldn't matter. In practice, it created confusion. Friendly troops would hear that sharp, unfamiliar crack and hesitate, uncertain if it was incoming or outgoing fire. The Japanese would hear it and know exactly where to look. A sniper's greatest asset is invisibility, and the Winchester announced itself every time it spoke. George started thinking hard about when it was worth breaking that silence. The march continued. The Marauders took Shaduzup, pushed south, cut the Hukawng Road, and turned east toward Myitkyina and the airfield that was their ultimate objective. By late April, the unit was disintegrating. Not from enemy action, though there had been plenty of that, but from simple attrition. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, scrub typhus, mite typhus, dengue fever, infected wounds, exhaustion, malnutrition. The Marauders had been promised that the operation would last 3 months and that they'd be rotated out. That promise proved optimistic. By the time they reached Myitkyina, they'd been in the jungle for nearly 80 days without rest, without resupply except what could be airdropped, without reinforcements, and the cumulative strain was catastrophic. Men were walking skeletons. The unit that had started with 3,000 effectives was down to fewer than 1,500 combat-capable soldiers, and even that number was generous. They were held together by momentum and the fact that turning back was worse than going forward. George was sick like everyone else. He'd had malaria twice, the fever coming in waves that left him shaking and delirious, and he'd lost weight he didn't have to lose. The rifle felt heavier every day. His hands shook when he tried to hold the crosshairs steady. He cleaned the weapon religiously, wiped down the scope, checked the action for rust and dirt, but the jungle was relentless. Moisture got into everything. The synthetic stock held up better than wood would have, but the metal parts sweated condensation, and he could feel the tolerances getting sluggish. The rifle still worked, but it worked grudgingly, and there were days when he wondered if it was worth the effort. The assault on Myitkyina Airfield began on May 17th. The plan was bold to the point of recklessness. The Marauders, supported by Chinese troops under Stilwell's command, would strike directly at the airfield in a surprise attack, bypassing the heavily defended approaches and hoping that speed and audacity would carry the day. It almost worked. The assault force reached the airfield perimeter, broke through the initial defenses, and seized part of the runway before the Japanese fully understood what was happening. But then the counterattack came, organized and furious, and the fight turned into a grinding stalemate. George was with the 2nd Battalion on the southern edge of the airfield. His role, as always, was to provide precision fire where it mattered, to take out key targets and support the infantry advance. The problem was that there were no key targets. The Japanese weren't obliging him with officers standing in the open or machine gun positions at convenient range. They were fighting from bunkers and spider holes and concealed positions in the tree line, and they were fighting with mortars and grenades and close-range automatic weapons. The battlefield was chaos. Smoke, noise, confusion, men running and shooting and dying, and nowhere in that chaos was there a place for a bolt-action rifle that required calm and a stable rest and time to aim. George fired his 3rd and final shot of the campaign during a Japanese counterattack on the 2nd day of the battle. A group of enemy soldiers was trying to flank the American position through a patch of scrub, moving low and fast, and George saw one of them pause to signal the others. 70 yards, maybe 80. Close enough that the scope was almost a hindrance. He fired offhand, no rest, and the man went down. Then George grabbed his sidearm and started shooting with the pistol because the rest of the enemy squad was already on top of them, and there was no time to work the bolt and chamber another round. The engagement turned into a desperate hand-to-hand scramble, rifles used as clubs, knives out, and when it was over, George's contribution had been 1 rifle shot and 6 pistol rounds and a lot of adrenaline. The Winchester hadn't failed. It had just been irrelevant. The battle for Myitkyina Airfield dragged on for days, then weeks. The Marauders were supposed to seize it and hold it long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Instead, they found themselves locked in a siege, surrounded by Japanese forces that were determined to take it back. Resupply became sporadic. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies ran out entirely. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable with proper care, and they died from diseases that proper rest and food would have prevented, and they kept fighting because there was no alternative. The airfield was a piece of flat ground carved out of the jungle, a strip of dirt and metal matting, and it became the most valuable real estate in northern Burma. George's rifle, that beautiful precision instrument, sat mostly unused. He carried it because it was his weapon, because abandoning it would feel like giving up, but he didn't fire it again. The tactical situations never materialized. There were no long sight lines, no patience, no time. The fighting was close and fast and brutal, and the men who survived were the ones who could put rounds downrange quickly and keep moving. The M1 Garand, that ugly, heavy, semi-automatic workhorse, proved itself over and over. 8 rounds, fast follow-up shots, reliable action even when caked with mud and fouled with powder residue. The Garand wasn't elegant, but elegance didn't matter. Effectiveness mattered, and the Garand was devastatingly effective in the environment where the Marauders found themselves. By the time the airfield was finally secured in early June, not by the Marauders, who had been reduced to a few hundred walking wounded, but by Chinese and American reinforcements flown in once the strip was operational, George had been in Burma for 91 days. He'd fired the Winchester 3 times. 3 shots, 3 hits, 3 tactically relevant outcomes, but also 3 data points that told a larger story. The bolt-action precision rifle, the apex of marksmanship technology for a generation, was becoming obsolete in the kind of war that Burma represented. The future didn't belong to the patient marksman. It belonged to the infantryman with a semi-automatic rifle who could fight at close range and keep pace with a mobile battlefield. George survived Burma, though barely. He was evacuated with the rest of the Marauders, medically unfit for further service, and spent months recovering from malaria and the cumulative damage of the campaign. He weighed 138 pounds when they pulled him out, down from 175. His hands still shook. His hearing was shot from all the firing without ear protection. But he was alive, and that put him ahead of a lot of his comrades. The 5,307th had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of the 3,000 men who had marched into Burma, fewer than 200 walked out under their own power. The rest were dead, missing, or so broken by disease and exhaustion that they'd never be combat effective again. The unit was disbanded. The survivors were scattered to other commands or sent home. Merrill's Marauders became a legend, one of those units that people would read about and romanticize, but the men who lived it knew the truth. They'd accomplished their mission, but the cost had been apocalyptic. George spent the rest of the war stateside, training new snipers and writing reports. The army wanted to understand what had worked and what hadn't. George gave them an honest assessment. The Winchester Model 70 was a superb rifle. His marksmanship had been solid. The doctrine was sound. But the environment had made all of it largely irrelevant. Burma wasn't a sniper's war. It was a war of attrition, of mobility, of firepower, and the tools that succeeded were the ones that matched those demands. The bolt-action rifle, no matter how accurate, couldn't compete with the volume of fire that a semi-automatic could deliver. The patient marksman, no matter how skilled, couldn't keep pace with a battlefield that moved faster than he could set up a shot. The report George wrote was technical, dry, full of after-action details and ballistic data, but the conclusion was clear. The future of American infantry doctrine would be built around the semi-automatic rifle. The Garand had proven itself in every theater, and Burma had been the final confirmation. Precision had its place, long-range interdiction, counter-sniper operations, specialized roles, but the backbone of infantry firepower would be volume, not accuracy. One good shot was fine. 8 good shots were better. The army read George's report, nodded, and filed it away. By the time the war ended, the decision had already been made. The next generation of American infantry would carry semi-automatic or fully automatic rifles. The bolt-action sniper rifle would remain in the inventory, but as a specialist tool, not a standard weapon. George's Winchester ended up in a museum. Not immediately and not with much fanfare, but eventually someone decided it was historically significant. The rifle that had killed 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days on Guadalcanal and had fired 3 times in 78 days in Burma became an exhibit, a physical artifact of a doctrinal transition that most people didn't even realize had happened. The placard next to it mentioned George's name, his service record, the specifications of the rifle. It didn't mention the larger story, the way Burma had quietly invalidated an entire generation of thinking about marksmanship and warfare. It didn't mention the irony of a perfect weapon becoming obsolete not because it failed, but because the world changed faster than the weapon could adapt. George himself never talked much about Burma. He'd done his job, survived, written his reports. That was enough. He went back to civilian life, worked in firearms design for a few years, consulted on military projects here and there, and eventually retired. He died in the early 90s, an old man with old wounds and old memories, and when people asked him about the war, he'd usually deflect. The stories he told were from Guadalcanal, the clean ones, the ones where skill and patience had made a difference. Burma wasn't a story you told at dinner parties. Burma was a place where 3,000 men had walked in and 200 had walked out, and no amount of marksmanship could change those numbers. The lessons from Burma rippled forward through American military history, though few people connected the dots directly. Korea saw the continued dominance of the semi-automatic rifle, with the M1 Garand serving effectively in terrain that was often more open than Burma but still demanded volume of fire. Vietnam brought the M14 and then the M16, fully automatic rifles that could spray bullets in the jungle close-quarters combat that defined much of that war. The bolt-action rifle persisted in specialized sniper roles, refined and improved, but it was never again considered the primary infantry weapon. The battlefield had moved on. And yet there's something worth preserving in what George represented. The idea that skill matters, that patience and precision can, in the right circumstances, achieve outcomes that brute force cannot. 11 Japanese snipers in 4 days wasn't luck. It was craft, honed over years, applied with discipline and intelligence. The fact that Burma rendered that craft mostly useless doesn't diminish what George accomplished on Guadalcanal. It just means that war is contextual, that what works brilliantly in one environment can fail completely in another, and that adaptability matters more than perfection. The Winchester Model 70 sitting in that museum is more than a rifle. It's a question frozen in wood and steel. What happens when the world changes and your expertise doesn't? What do you do when the skills you've mastered suddenly don't apply? George faced that question every day in Burma, carrying a rifle that had made him a legend and was now just extra weight. He didn't have a good answer because there wasn't one. You adapt or you fail, and sometimes adaptation means recognizing that your role has changed, that what you bring to the fight isn't what the fight needs anymore. The story of John George and his rifle is often told as a footnote, a curiosity in the larger narrative of World War II. Sniper kills 11 enemies in 4 days, good for him. Sniper only fires 3 times in 3 months, interesting anomaly. But the real story is bigger than that. It's about how technology and terrain and tactics intersect in ways that can't be predicted from theory alone. It's about how doctrines evolve, not through grand strategic decisions made in conference rooms, but through hard lessons learned in places like the Hukawng Valley where men died from fever and exhaustion as much as from bullets. It's about the quiet death of one way of fighting and the rise of another, and how that transition often goes unnoticed except by the men who lived through it. Burma broke the Marauders, but it also taught the American military something vital. War had changed. The battlefield of 1944 wasn't the battlefield of 1918, and it wouldn't be the battlefield of 1964 either. Mobility, firepower, and endurance mattered more than ever. The romantic image of the lone marksman, picking off enemies from a hidden position with surgical precision, was giving way to the reality of mobile infantry warfare where survival depended on speed and volume. The sniper would always have a role, but it would be a specialized one, a supporting element rather than a primary combat arm. The future belonged to the men who could move fast, shoot fast, and adapt to chaos. George understood this, even if it meant confronting the limits of his own expertise. He'd been the best at what he did, and Burma had shown him that being the best sometimes isn't enough. The jungle doesn't care about your skill. The enemy doesn't fight on your terms. And the war, that vast impersonal machine, will grind forward regardless of whether your particular talents are useful or not. That's a hard lesson, but it's an honest one. And George faced it with the same quiet professionalism he'd brought to everything else. The rifle in the museum is silent now, as silent as it was for most of those 78 days in Burma. It sits behind glass, preserved and honored, a relic of a moment when warfare was caught between 2 eras. Visitors walk past it, read the placard, maybe pause to admire the craftsmanship. Few of them understand what it represents. Fewer still connect it to the larger story of how military doctrine evolves, how hard-won lessons from places like Burma ripple forward through generations, shaping the way armies train and fight and think about their tools. But that silence, that absence of fire, is its own kind of testimony. It speaks to the men who carried weapons they barely used, who marched until they couldn't stand, who fought diseases that had no enemy to shoot back at. It speaks to the gap between expectation and reality, between the war you trained for and the war you got. And it speaks to the uncomfortable truth that progress often means leaving behind things that were once valuable, once essential, once perfect for their time. John George's war was 2 wars, really. One where his skill and his rifle made him exceptional. Another where neither mattered much at all. He lived through both, learned from both, and when it was over, he told the truth about what he'd seen. That honesty, more than the 11 kills or the 3 shots or the rifle itself, is his real legacy. War doesn't care about your myths, cares about what works. And what worked in Burma wasn't what anyone expected. The same rifle, the same man. 11 kills in 4 days, 3 shots in 78. The difference wasn't John George. It wasn't the Winchester. It was everything else. The terrain, the mission, the enemy, the pace of battle, the nature of warfare itself. And that difference, that collision between a marksman's war and a machine's war, told the American military something it needed to hear. The future had already arrived. They just needed to recognize it. So the rifle sits in its case, a monument to a transition no one celebrated and few people noticed. And somewhere in the archives, George's reports gather dust, read by the occasional historian or doctrinal analyst who's trying to understand how the Army learned to fight the wars that came after. The lessons are still there. The questions are still relevant. When does expertise become obsolete? How do you adapt when the world changes faster than you can? What do you do when the skills that defined you stop matching? John George found his answers in the jungles of Burma, marching with a rifle he barely fired, watching the war move past him at a pace his doctrine couldn't match. He came home, wrote it down, and moved on. The rifle stayed behind, in a sense, frozen at that moment of transition. And we're left with the story, the strange and uncomfortable story of how one of the best snipers in the Pacific Theater spent 2.5 months in the most brutal campaign of the war and fired his weapon 3 times. That's not failure. That's evolution. And evolution is rarely kind to the things it leaves behind. If the story changed how you think about war, about adaptation, or about the gap between skill and circumstance, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below. Do you think modern warfare still has room for the patient specialist? Or has speed and volume become everything? Hit that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into the moments where history pivots on details most people miss. And if this one resonated, give it a like. It helps more people find these stories. Thanks for watching.